How do you make sure that your agents behave the right way?
The AI is learning from the queries you're given, then it starts making its own interpretation. So we try to eliminate that by restricting the amount of tools.
So say there's a non-compliant patient.
So that's tricky because
And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but
no,
this is
no,
like I said, it's like a huge problem because like there's
yes,
what's good for them and there's what they're doing.
when an agent acts on following a specific workflow that was designed, who takes the liability? Does the patient, does the system that's creating that's hosting the agent takes the liability, or does the provider take that liability? So that's the line where it's like, uh, with the industry still needs to define exactly.
Hi, I'm Alex Salkever with the Agentic AI Foundation, and I'm here today with Kingsley Madikaegbu. Did I
Yes,
correct that the right way?
that's correct.
We're at MCP Dev Summit in North America in New York City. Kingsley's company, HealID, is exploring novel use cases for MCP and Agentic AI in the healthcare system. Kingsley, welcome.
Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about HealID and what you're thinking about doing with the technology there.
Cool. Yeah. Well, I think in healthcare, there was a lot of comes into multiple use cases around it. From your provider, their workflow, the clinical workflow, the actual patient on how they actually interact with their medical records, and everything in mind. Everything that's currently developed used has the patient in points of view where, after a hospital is discharged, the doctor usually provides some kind of rigid summary of their visits, which is then given to the patient, and the patient has to kind of like find a way to kind of, digest that information and kind of follow through on the recommendation that was provided by clinicians. And what HealID does is HealID makes the connection between not just the patient and the doctors, but also a lot of the intermediary, like your caregivers, your family network. And one thing we find out is like a lot of those outward visits, especially for patients with chronic condition, the person that actually keeps the most burden of putting that pieces together from the clinical records perspective that the clinician has, the symptoms the patient are experiencing, and the caregiver that's actually observing in between is the family. So they tend to end up holding that burden of like piecing all this fragmented data and trying to make sense of what is going on. And they also have their own point of view into like how the whole um, process can be more efficient. And that's where MCP comes in. And MCP kind of like looks at this from an agentic workflow perspective, where each of those individuals, like the patient, the provider, and the caregiver and the family, all have their own agent accessing the same data and doing the piecemeal between what they need to use, how they need to use the data, and what they need to see.
So give me a hypothetical. Say someone has open heart surgery, they're returned to home. They probably have like 25 pages of care instructions. There's an occupational therapist. There's pharmacy because they have a whole bunch of medicines that they have to take after surgery. There's the physical therapist. There's the nurses who still need to be informed about blood pressure and wound healing. And then there's the surgeon who cares about things. And then there's the caregiver, the spouse or whatever. Tell me how that would all work together.
Yeah, so I think from the fundamental layers is the data layer. So in how we kind of like segmented our activity to four different pillars, where we have the data layer and we have the raw data in the raw form, like unstructured form, where we take in the medical record that was prescribed by the doctor, parse that information into a data store. The data is just dumb data, no logic, nothing built in.
It's often paper. You
It's
get out of the
literally
hospital and they give you a piece of like a stack of paper.
exactly, exactly. And I think what our system does, like, we start out with personal information into a structured form, and just but with no actual logic, nothing built in. And on top of that, that's where we actually set a context permission on top of the data layer that identified authenticated users what access they have to what. So in the example you gave of your provider that's making a medication request, they have a specific workflow and specific permission that they need to do on that particular patient's medical record. And we map that. On top of that, we layer on top the MCP, and the MCP server has its own set of permission and on what tools it has access to, what specific permission is able to do for that given workflow. And on top of that, MCP, then we have the agent. Now, the agent has I'm more focused on the reason, the capability, and so the doctor um, has a specific set of workflow, but is not able to actually visualize the data in a different workflow um, of because they don't have although they have the same database, but are not able to actually see those particular records. An example would be like records around like mental health if they're not a mental health specialist. So only records that's pertaining to their permission, that's what they're able to have access to and make those requests. And it's also time bound. So we're able to set time bound on each of this different workflow of how long are they able to live and to what extent of permission, to much extent of which they're able to have.
So I have a long list of questions, which of course I basically dropped your talk description into Claude and said, prompt me. What should I ask Kingsley? So why do you say MCP is the right architectural use case choice for this use case?
Yeah, so initially, the initial architecture was the API REST-based architecture where we had,
REST based. You didn't
yes,
even think of graph. You were thinking REST.
yes.
Okay.
So I mean, but how without NCP, how that architecture will look like will be you're making a request to a specific endpoint and say, I want to update this record. Then you lay it on top of an agent. That agent kind of queries that
Right.
that REST piece URI and says, okay, this is the result that returns it back. I think in order to enforce compliance, data restrictions, it requires a lot of encoding, a lot of logic, not just in the agent level, but also the data level and also the security level, and which makes it very complex. And you have to hold a whole list of permissions. For example, if someone is a caregiver and all they want to, the information they really want to say is, as my parents taking their medication, versus a doctor wants to see a little bit more than just how they're taking their medication. They want to know how much dose have they taken. And as a patient, you're concerned if the medication that is being prescribed conflict with a medication you're already taking. So this kind of like complex workflow makes it very difficult to implement on AI, and also there's a huge risk of violating a lot of policy there. But I think MCP makes it cleanly be able to set specific rules and permission on your MCP server that segregates the amount of permission they're able to access in regards in the data layer. And by doing so clearly, easily, we're able to kind of audit every single step an agent is taking. So the agent being able to access a particular record, they have 4 different checkpoints that they have to go through before they're able to prove that that permission is requested. But also we're able to see that log in that traceability, and which is easier for compliance and easier for you to be able to demonstrate not just compliance but also auditability for HIPAA and other providers access, because that's something they really care about. Just being able to say, this particular person access this record, and it was not just an agent like just doing this thing, doing random snipping around into my database. So being able to prove that in a health setting is something that is critical for a lot of organizations operating in a regulated space.
So like for example, I've heard from and my doctor friends working with the EMRs is very challenging because you literally get permission fatigue. It's like Claude Code, except like every 5 seconds you accept this, you acknowledge that, or whatever. Does this help potentially streamline some of the navigations of all of these very complex regulations under the covers that you'd see in EMRs?
Yes, I think if it's adopted at a wild scale, there's a potential ability to be able to create that segregation layer and the audit, which is mentioned. So I think there's all this question about like liability.
Right.
So like who is liable
The
for it?
being HIPAA is essentially like
Ex-
that's what it's all about, liability. So
Exactly. So I think yes, it simplifies it, but again, a proper I guess we haven't seen it actually applied into a large scale system, but still being able to recognize, like, when an agent acts on following a specific workflow that was designed, who takes the liability? Does the patient, does the system that's creating that's hosting the agent takes the liability, or does the provider who take that liability? So that's the line where it's like, with the industry still needs to define exactly.
well, you probably saw some guys out of Stanford and someplace else just launched an insurance company for AI agents. Did you see that?
No, I'm curious.
Now they will insure specific AI agents. I think they're initially starting with 11 labs for voice agents.
Oh,
But I
nice.
mean, like the whole goal is like we will underwrite your agent if you can demonstrate sufficiently that you have the guardrails in place.
Yeah,
Anyway, just I can send you a link to that later.
yeah, that'll be cool.
So what healthcare integration problems specific? Because we talked a little bit about what you're doing, and then also why MCP, and we talked a bit about healthcare, but what healthcare integration problems specifically do you think MCP is better for? You talked a bit about HIPAA, but let's sort of take it up a level almost because like healthcare is its own unique beast, and strip away the jargon to just like normal problems that people think about that they get solved by that.
Yeah, so I think a good knowledge to think about is, you can think of it as MCP as kind of like a bouncer in a nightclub.
Good analogy.
So like each and the agent will be more like, a guest coming into the club. MCP acts as a rather than just um a, tagging the guest as, or as a member and checking up a VIP list. MCP is actually reorganizing the whole club for that one particular guest. So when one guest comes in, it's a whole different club setup versus another guest, and that's how when you put that in the hospital setting, is how a patient interacts with their actual record. It's a lot different from how a provider would interact with the record. So things doctors care about is more of like, am I prescribing a medication that conflict with another medicine that the patient is taking? A lot of times it's just a guesswork problem provider also struggle with is the medication that the hospital that was prescribed, has it been exhausted? Is the patient actually adhering to the medication? So that's another things that they do care about. And as a family member, you want to see if there is if your parents or involved, they're actually improving in the care that they're receiving. And which is a whole different experience of what you want to do, and also the workflow. When you think about it's like, how do I reach out to my parents if I notice something that's concerning? So, but also from the patient standpoint, you also want to know if there's a correlation between the medication you're taking and your heart rate. Am I, is my blood pressure increasing, or when I'm taking some medication, is it actually working? Is that disrupting my sleep patterns? So all that insightful information is how each different stakeholder has a different um, way of interacting with the same particular data.
Yeah.
And MCP provides that abstraction and allows us to be able to customize different agent for different workflow, and customize different reasoning capability and patterns on how they should approach the same data and the information that is forwarded, and the action also that is taken. So
So, like real world example, I mean, because a lot of medicine that's exactly just describing now, which is super interesting, is extensibility out into. I mean, I think Johnson and Johnson actually calls it like real world data analytics or something like that. Where for example, someone that has had a history of arrhythmia, their Apple Watch is actually pretty decent as a first line indicator.
yeah,
So, how do you then extend into additional data sources with MCP? Is that the right way to do it, or sort of explain a little bit how that might
yeah,
work?
yeah. So example you gave is you experience that symptoms. The first person as well is also the patient. They receive a notification in the phone, and also if someone within the care network, like their family or
Right.
someone that is like authorized to be, I say authorized caregiver, are notified like your parents just experienced sudden change in arrhythmia. Now the question is, the agent is trained like, what is the next step into that
Right.
in that scenario? One, allow the physician how critical it is. So we have to train. What is the severity? Is this something that needs to be addressed right away? Should you call a ambulance care, or it's not it's something that it could be scheduled. So these are the kind of areas where we have to kind of really tread quickly, and it's also we're working with doctors to actually decide what is the right threshold to be able to set on a given condition, given their past history.
Yeah.
So that's still the layer where we're kind of like really working with providers to understand, a given patient's condition, what condition is considered severe, and what actions should the system take versus what it shouldn't take, and that's we're currently solving that issue.
And how do you bake the context in at that level? So, like, as an example, because this is actually someone I know has done this, if you worry a lot about arrhythmia, there's actually an app that, will you push a button on on your wrist, on your watch, and it will send it to an EKG review team. I think it's remote somewhere in
Mhm.
the Philippines or something like that, and it'll real-time read, on like, okay, does this look bad? What do your arrhythmia look like? And send you back a report. And now it's actually like an AI is doing the read,
Yeah,
but so essentially you can create these workflows where, oh, okay, this looks not so bad. I'll send it there for context, or we'll send it there for context, and then if it looks bad, automate, like kick it up to. So how do you like inject
yeah.
context to create these fluid workflows?
Yeah, exactly, and I think that's a good use case where where we send the AI actually does the review and scanning, and what we just look at like the first time maybe indication, maybe it could be a false positive, but if we start to see a pattern, then the next action will be we provide the provider, the patient, the authorities like this has repeated for the past um, 3 times in the past 2 months. um, we recommend scheduling a appointment. Would you like to schedule it? And now the agents that does the scheduling, which is separate from the agent that's don't do sending the alerts, actually makes the scheduling, work with this provider, look into the availability, and actually book the appointment for the patient to come in for an actual screening with the primary care. But also another workflow we're also looking into is like even in advance of actually the doctor's visits, the doctor already has a summary of what is going on. They're able to look at things that like um, what is the sleep pattern, and also be able to rule out other things in advance of the meeting. So they're finding out they're able to be more efficient in providing care, and also they're able to provide the quality of care is also improving
Right.
because they have a little bit more holistic information rather than just the information that we see during the actual visit.
So let me ask a harder question, and I actually think this is quite relevant.
Okay.
So say there's a non-compliant patient, and the data shows, that because I have a lot of doctor friends who are they work in public health clinics, and
Yeah.
that's a huge problem with a large part. Um, Obviously, like with MCP, it's the perfect vehicle to run the agents.
Yeah.
How do we think about that, like permissioning and those? I mean, I know this is like out on the edge, but I'm just kind of curious.
Okay. So let me make sure I understand. You mean like a patient that they've been received a recommendation from the doctor, but they're not adhering to it? Is that
Exactly.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah? So that's tricky because
And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but
no,
this is
no.
like it's like a huge problem because like there's
Yeah.
what's good for them and there's what they're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but I the way we structure it is like we leave two things with a design principle. One, the patient are in charge of
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
decision. So whatever suggestion, whether a provider can recommend something,
Or could a
uh,
patient like have their caregiver basically like a full award, like, okay, my caregiver can see this and can understand whether to forward this to doctors or whatever. And
yeah, that permission it depends. We separated caregivers into two different
yeah,
categories. So there's caregivers that is actually um, one they have one legal right, but also they've been given explicit permission. So someone like a minor, for example, that they're still under the care of their parents.
Like in California, actually, it's a huge problem because, like, if your kid's in college and they're over 18, you can no longer like see their health records,
Yeah.
even though often you need to see their health records. It just
Yeah. So it's tricky. So I think, but there's also that one piece. But there's also a caregiver that you kind of assigned as someone to maybe to look after you, and some
yeah.
of them are maybe there could also be a paid caregiver. So that's how we separated this piece. And I forgot what's the original question you asked there.
I'm sorry. I know it was essentially like there are these cases where we see it where the patient or a person that would be potentially benefit from the agentic system may not want, they're
Yeah.
non-compliant patients, like I said, which
Yeah,
is a
yeah,
large,
yeah,
large,
yeah,
large problem.
yeah. So yeah, exactly. I mean, the ultimate thing is like we leave the decision all up to either the patient to kind of like make the decision whatever they want to do about their life, but also the caregiver that are like required authorized caregivers that are authorized to make that decision. So in the case of like a minor, that falls into the legal category. The main thing is like we're very focused on we do not want the system to breach any um, regulatory or safety requirements.
Right.
So that's the core design principle around. And also, the second thing I also look into is also we also want patients to feel have control over their health, and that's something we see in doing our research. Is,
Yeah.
everyone wants autonomy over their health. They want to be able to make decisions, and sometimes even they might some recommendations that's presented, they might not even want to disclose.
Right.
So a classic example was even with my dad. He's one of our
Oh,
tests,
awesome. Yeah.
and we're having a meeting with the doctor, and he's like telling the doctor, "Yeah, so I've been taking this medication, and for some reason my blood pressure is still trending high." But I'm like, the doctor's like, "Are you also exercising?" And it's like, "Yeah, I'm exercising." But you could look at the data and you're like, "Okay, well, the data is showing that you're not really walking, you're not putting in enough steps."
Yeah.
So, but the data is like, is that source of truth that could kind of be accurate? And sometimes the doctor might know has that information. They know that this person is not exercising, but regardless, they needs to kind of be able to work with them in
Yeah.
in their capabilities and say, well, maybe next time you should exercise a little bit more. And you see that also even in some settings where someone goes to the dentist and the dentist is like, "Oh, are you brushing and you flushing daily?" And you're like, "Yeah, I'm flushing daily." And the dentist can actually clearly see a lot of plaque, and they could tell that you're not flushing daily, but they give the encouragement to adhere to the processes. But regardless, it falls down to the actual patients in taking the ownership and actually doing the recommendations. And where our platform provides that um, accountability and that auditability to be able to say, "Oh, yes, this patient is actually following my recommendations." And they're not seeing an improvement from the provider perspective, so they can actually assess if the recommendations they're providing is the right recommendation they
So,
should be
like for
given.
GLP prescription or something like
Exactly,
that, or if
exactly,
they're adhering to best practices
exactly.
and they're exercising or whatever, and they're
Yeah,
still,
yeah,
yeah.
and
No, it's interesting because it's almost like an intermediate. So, like for example, I mean, it gives you these intermediate options that weren't there before. I mean, some of it's verification, but also like, if there's a non-compliant patient, you could have an option that's like, okay, I'm going to tell their spouse to talk to them about what's going on with this. Where you
yeah,
don't disclose, but
yeah.
you push, or you tell the doctor, without actually violating privacy, which is like, that wasn't an option before because they
Mhm.
couldn't even see that.
That's true, that's true. So you're able to kind of nudge the family in the right way to kind of
Right.
care.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
So which parts of your workflows are deterministic? Which are rule based versus model driven, right? And how do you determine which parts should be which?
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a good question. So for I think even what I mentioned earlier, anything that is regulatory, and anything that is clinical and like life saving is very deterministic.
So binary.
Binary. It's more like so we do not want to be in a process that violates any government regulations. And the way we structure is, and MCP allows us to do that is like from the data layer where we kind of like don't embed any logic in the data layer. The access layer is where we kind of like set our permissions.
Right.
Then on top of that, we layer on top of the MCP layer. So the MCP only use specific tools that it has permissions to do so. And those tools are directly assigned to a specific set of data. So a given example would be like, if someone has a high, their blood pressure has been trending high for a while. We don't say, you're at risk of a heart attack. We kind of like share that information with their provider. And the provider comes into the workflow and determine, is this severe enough for me to request for the patient to schedule an appointment? And if the provider identifies that their behavior is concerning, then the provider themselves have to actually approve of the agent to actually make that decision, actually requested for the patients to come in for an appointment. So the provider is also able to set that criticality. So that's how we're able to make that distinction. Is where it's clinical, direct that to the provider. Have them make the decision of what the patient should do. Things that are regulatory is the strict 4 error or like no, or we just
That's absolutely prescriptive, and
exactly, and no access to the data given that particular workflow, and then the workflow, the agent also doesn't have even the um the visibility to be able to access the data even if they wanted to.
so I mean, we've seen instances where agents, you know, they take on a life of their own. I mean, you probably saw like what happened with Meta with the OpenClaw instance that
Yeah,
got loose on the Meta security head's email. Which was, and she posted about it. It was fascinating. How do you make sure that your agents behave the right way? How do you keep them on the leash? And I mean, obviously sandboxing, but like in terms of how you're building this.
that is a good question, and I think the 4 layers segregation layer is something that we're seeing good results on where what I mentioned before, the whole API based context, like when the AI is making a lot of all these calls and making all this query, the AI is learning from the queries you're given, then it starts making its own interpretation. So we try to eliminate that by restricting the amount of tools the each particular agent we assign. So your provider agent, the patient's workflow, to kind of like its own sets of permission behavior. And we also do something that is a little bit different, is where we kind of like create like a metadata of sorts for each of the agent's behavior that kind of records their behavior, and we're able to kind of correlate it into um, to identify if there's some drift
So you're
in.
looking for anomaly or drift.
Exactly.
Okay. And I'm curious, like in the same vein, so one of the magic that I've seen, at least with LLMs, in this area, is that it can put patients almost on par with physicians and having conversations. Obviously, they are, humans are, they're doctors, but they're human. So like an example I know from someone's life in my around me was that they looked in ChatGPT where like, hey, my blood sugar is not going down. Is that related to my statin? And ChatGPT actually like explained to them that the statin they were on was a good statin, but they could switch to a different one that might actually, not impact A1C as much. And so they had the conversation with their provider and they switched. It helped. And it wasn't like the provider didn't know. It was just more the provider had so many things going on that that's not what they think about. How do you uh, use MCP to inject from the models, and I'm assuming you're using a
Hmm.
couple different models,
Hmm.
that type of context, and also take advantage of the way MCP works to create that sort of capability. I'm not sure if that's what you do at all, but
Yeah, so we're not doing that. I
okay,
think there's,
sorry, yeah.
but I mean, I think that has a lot of like risk, and I think we're seeing that. I think was it in Utah where um, they kind of created a regulations around the use of AI in the medical
Yeah, I don't
side.
know, they're getting pretty serious
Yeah, yeah,
about it,
yeah.
yeah.
So how we kind of segregate is like the agent is more of like uh, the different agent has different workflow, different personality. And the agent that interacts with the patient is more of a coach and less of a clinical
Got it.
decision maker,
Okay.
and it's more like looking at, okay, based on the recommendation that your doctor
Right.
prescribed, you should do X, Y, and Z. So what we did is like we always assign each of the action or the recommendations the agent is providing specific to a particular either clinical note that the doctor actually created, or like the biometrics information that we receive from the patient's wearable information to be able to say this is where the source of that information came from. So we could say stuff like last Tuesday in your meeting with the doctor, doctor recommended to do A, B, and C. You're able to look into that and see the raw data of exactly the notes that you captured and what the doctor's recommendation. So you're able to kind of identify this some information drift. So that's how we're kind of our workflow kind of works. But from the clinical side, it's a whole different workflow, and we have a more medically trained model that is able to kind of provide the doctors like, this is some information you were seeing based on the patient's data, and just some more information for the provider to kind of consider. Um, doing our research, we noticed that some provider that interested in knowing some of that information because they want to be ahead of like what's the latest training and understanding of like in a particular disease or an infection. But there's some provider that are very skeptical about AI giving them recommendation. So that's kind of how the clinical workflow usually exists, is where we're providing information to the clinicians, and clinicians kind of making their judgment on whether that's something they should consider or like validate, versus information going to the patient that or that use case you presented about a patient using ChatGPT to kind of read a health summary.
What kind of failure modes have you seen and how have you mitigated that?
I think that's a good question. The first is a scenario where the particular patient has like a relationship drift with their family or the caregiver, and all of a sudden they're like, "Hey, well, I want to kind of restrict the access. I don't want them to be able to kind of like to check on me anymore." And I think that area is like initially it's kind of like although they have access, but the information, maybe they're restricted access, but the information is still transmitted. So they're able to receive some form of a response that is that's not completed. So what we did is to kind of like treat the permission as almost like a shut off switch, where as soon as the request permission is revoked, instantly it returns a 404 error. So it doesn't show any partial information or partially generated information. It's just the request is returns like, "Mm, I'm sorry, we can the agent is not working," or
Yeah,
yeah. So that's how we
it's very
kind of
abrupt.
very abrupt. Like so we try to do that quite time on the permission layer, where the patient has that almost kill switch to that permission. So that's the first one. Um, and I think we also see is also kind of like the whole liability question comes into play of like who takes liability on if issue does occur in a production setting. So, and these are the areas where I think we're design around like action a action level where we're able to assign providers action specific to the agent's behavior. So we're able to say if a medical professional recommend a medication for patients to be taken, the medical and the agent needs to be adhered strictly to what the recommendation was provided by the professional, and so they're able to adopt that as I mean, they're able to take that liability if there's a drift in that, but also if there was a drift into the recommendation that the provider provided, but the agent made a mistake, then obviously the agent takes that liability. So that's how we kind of just segregate it. So those are some of the challenges where we're still addressing. Also, even a big industry type challenge.
Are you also layering additional like A to A or to designing so that your agents can interact with other agents too? Or what else are you thinking about on top of MCP to extend the functionality?
That's interesting. We haven't really explored it. I think our focus right now is just trying to get the agents providing consistent results and we're seeing progress in that area where it's like, we're able to provide that, that traceability within in audits. So yeah, but maybe in the future, and I think that's probably where the industry is heading towards, where agent will be interacting with other agents. There was an agent that your agent goes into the provider's agent and it does a whole bunch of other workflow, kicks all other workflow processes. So that's something that I could see, the industry going towards. But I think in the health or the regulated industry in general, I think it will be much slower. Uh,
Of course.
yeah,
Yeah.
much slower. Yeah, I mean, there are hospitals that still use paper. So
Oh, no, I know. Discharge instructions
yeah,
are still,
exactly, it's still
yeah,
paper.
I was not joking because I've seen discharge
Yeah,
instructions. So,
yeah. I think that is long ways, and I think in the past couple of years, there's been a lot of easing some of the restrictions around data. So I'm seeing a little bit more innovation in that space, and a lot of startups are coming with creative solutions to address that challenge. And I think there's some more features. I think the MCP community in general, I think can invest in, especially for a regulated industry, and it can be applied not just in healthcare, also in finance or other or legal or other areas that requires a lot of strict enforcement of data.
let's round it out on that point in that specific question, which is if you had a wish list for the technical committee of here's the things I would love to see in MCP to help me or help other people in the healthcare sector better use it as a as a platform for agentic AI and building highly functional app. What would you say? Like, what's my wish list?
So the first one is that I don't know the right word to put it, but it's being able to kind of identify on your MCP server the enforcement um, traceability. So right now, like what we're doing is we created, I mentioned we created a static caching layer that addresses each agent, what specific tools they're using and how they're accessing it. So right now, there's no, I haven't seen any particular MCP server that actually has that also already embedded.
So there's like no hotel spans or anything like that.
Exactly. So there's always this weird workaround. Like for example, like if a given agent, you only need it to be um, live for maybe 2 weeks. It's not something you can kind of like enforce on the NCP layer where you can able to shut off the access on the time bound setting. How some of the things we do as a workaround is like created that caching layer of logs that kind of like creates that audit of like based on this setting that you're writing into this log, it has this time bound, and we kind of make an request that just shuts off that service. So if that was something that was embedded by default in a lot of MCP servers, I think that would be something that will help in the regulated industry perspective, and I think it will be more with a little bit more adoption in that area.
Anything else that jumps to mind or?
What I think another thing is just more around the all security related guardrails that prevent how prevent agents from communicating with each other and giving them siloed data access. So this, I mean, we have a lot of, I mentioned the three layer stack of how we kind of address that issue, that issue. But these are the two things um, I think MCP needs to be really more robust and to be able to attract more enterprise level implementation.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for coming and sharing all this. I learned a lot. And hopefully I will be able to use HealID and well, not hopefully not. I don't like the sick people, but if I have to,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
will be able to use HealID in the future.
Awesome.
Hope you have a good summit and hope to see you at another event.
Thank you, thank you. I appreciate you interviewing me and just giving me the opportunity just to share what we're doing, and also being part of this community of just a lot of 8 engineers just building and just learning the next level of agentic deployment, which is really excited to just be part of. So thank you for what you do, and I really enjoyed this conversation and just giving us the opportunity just to just present what we're doing. Thanks.
Thanks, Kingsley.